Hey everybody, this is Chuck Marohn with Strong Towns. Welcome. I did a program with The Ohio State University the other day, and we had a lot of questions that were submitted and only got to a handful of them. So I said, send them to me and I'll see what I can do. And I am going to try to, within a reasonable amount of time, go through 4 pages of questions here and answer them. I did sort them a little bit, so I'm hoping that we can get some themes and kind of roll through some of these. Let me just say off the bat, if you go to action.strongtowns.org, that's ACTION.strongtowns.org, you will get the Strong Towns Action Lab. And on there, we have tried to organize, and it's an ongoing process. We're still working on it, but we've got a lot of our content on there kind of organized in ways that are searchable, in ways that can get you at some of these answers. And if you don't find what you're looking for, you can actually go to the community part of that site and enter your own question in. And we will get that, and we will do our best to answer that, or someone in the Strong Towns ecosystem will do that. Let me get started. The first little group here I put as Detroit and slash causes of decline. So Elizabeth asks, do you have any critiques for Detroit's development and what some cities following their footsteps should change? I basically have said that the entire post-World War II development pattern that has been adopted wide scale across North America was first pioneered by Detroit. And so we are essentially all copying Detroit and all following to one step or another in their foot, in the path that they wore. So do I have any critiques? I have a whole book, like my book, Strong Towns, is essentially a critique of Detroit's development pattern. I would just call it the North American development pattern. They're just early to the party. Michael then asks about Detroit. If urban places run a profit for the city and suburban places don't, you would think that in the regions where the suburbs are independent municipalities, suburbs would be broke. So for example, Detroit's would be much more messed up than Detroit itself. And yet the opposite seems to be the case. Why is this? I think the first part of your premise is not exactly right. If urban places run a profit for the city and suburban places don't, that is not always, that's not like universally true. What's universally true is that pre-depression development patterns tend to be financially more productive. I used what is always true and then tend to in the same sentence. So let me make that clear. Every place that we have ever modeled the pre-depression development pattern, the core of the city, and the surrounding neighborhoods are financially more productive than the rest of the development pattern. That being the case, I can say with confidence that the core downtown in my city, if part of it is profitable, certainly the city itself is not as a whole, including the core neighborhoods, just because, and I'll go to the Taco John's example, just because we've denuded our tax base and eroded it. So I think it's important to keep profitability and, productivity as kind of 2 separate things in our mind. Certainly in order to be profitable, you have to be productive, but just because you're more productive than something else doesn't mean you're profitable or you're making the city money. The question though seems to go to like, hey, these suburbs should be broke because have a less productive development pattern than Detroit, but that's not the case. What happened? I think it's important not to look at this as like a beginning and an end stage, but more look at it as like diet and exercise. If someone has good diet and exercise, they can withstand a lot of things. They can, withstand disease. They can withstand, other ailments that might hit them better than someone who is in a very fragile state. When I look at Detroit, I look at a city that made itself really, really fragile. And then when it started to get hit with things like, decline of manufacturing and job loss and shifts, just did not have the capacity to recover from that. There wasn't the stable base. Their margin of error was too thin in a sense. When I look at the suburbs of Detroit, what I see is this rolling pattern of, boom, stagnation, decline, the Ponzi scheme that I describe in chapter 3 of my book. The idea that you can, for a very short period of time, buy yourself prosperity at the expense of your long-term health. And I would say to a lot of the suburbs around Detroit, just give them time. I mean, they're on the same trajectory. Eric asks, hasn't Detroit declined for other reasons such as massive job losses? I don't want people to draw too much from Detroit or think that like Detroit, when I say Detroit pioneered this development pattern, I'm not saying that like LA is Detroit or, you know, some suburb of Dallas is Detroit, is like, you know, they're the same city. They're obviously not. I think going back to this diet and exercise analogy, Detroit shifted from a development pattern that was very productive, gave it a lot of margin for error, gave it a lot of fallback room, a lot of capacity to, first of all, build on a stable base, and second of all, be adaptable and flexible. They shifted to a different development pattern, one that allowed them to grow very, very quickly, but at the expense of their overall resilience and at the expense of their overall balance sheet. They took on lots of liabilities in order to grow this way. And so, yeah, when they experienced job losses, their economy was not able to adapt. It was not able to change. They wound up in even more desperate situations and doing even more desperate things. You know, when you look at Detroit, you get the old, I think it was Hemingway quote, you know, how'd you go bankrupt? Slowly, then all at once, right? If you look at the bankruptcy of Detroit, it was, promise they didn't keep, promise they didn't keep, promise they didn't keep. You know, like we won't maintain that street. We won't provide fire protection to that neighborhood. We won't be able to do this. Followed by, you know, ever riskier kind of financial shenanigans to try to stay one step ahead of the collapse. And ultimately they were not able to do that. They got into something very risky. It didn't go well. And, things fell apart financially, and they were forced into bankruptcy. Is this decline for, just massive job losses? Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. I don't think that there's any doubt that Detroit in the 20th century would have experienced some level of decline. Would it be decline the way it has, where it really, in many ways, is, not just a shadow of its own self, but in some places, one of the kind of strangest, most surreal examples of decline that you'll ever see. I mean, whole neighborhoods abandoned, houses that exist and 3 years later are buried amongst trees and shrubs. It's a very surreal kind of place. Would that exist if not for, this development pattern experiment? And I don't think so. I think they go through and I think good examples of this would be like a city like Liverpool, which in an English standpoint is not considered a very successful city, not considered a very prosperous city. But if you went there today, it has gone through massive amounts of decline, deindustrialization, complete shift in their development pattern or their, reason for existing, their economic pattern. Yet the city is not falling apart and in fact is kind of a nice place. If you want a North American example, I think Pittsburgh is probably closer, to a place that experienced something synonymous to Detroit, but had, for many reasons, a little bit more fallback position, like a little bit, they did not, because of some weird things in their taxation system, did not denude their tax base as much as Detroit. And so when they experienced the job losses, certainly they suffered, certainly things were difficult, but they also had like the internal capacity to adapt to that. And I think, Pittsburgh is one of the most exciting cities in North America today. Delilah, gorgeous name, asked the question, I'm interested in your thoughts on inner ring suburbs, which were developed more densely before World War II. Are you familiar with Lakewood, Ohio, near Cleveland? I apologize, I'm not specifically. Original mixed use, built in the 1920s, lots of residential duplexes, big focus on maintaining housing stock. There's no question here, except am I familiar with them, which I'm not. I do think it's interesting that you can kind of see how the core insights of the traditional development pattern were abandoned over time. The first iteration of suburbanization that happened kind of synonymous with the adoption of the automobile, the streetcar suburbs, that kind of thing. Even in the 1950s, you still saw vestiges of this. I think Levittown certainly had this in it, where it was designed to adapt. It wasn't designed to be a stagnant entity. You didn't build it all at once, have it be finished, and then assume that it would never change. These places were still built in that adaptable framework. And so a lot of them have held up very well. A lot of them have managed to, even though they've been locked under glass and even though they've been frozen, they have a certain level of productivity to them and a certain kind of ingrained flexibility that has allowed them to do a lot better. I think you go and look at, 70, 80 years on, what some of the second and third ring suburbs that have been built in the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s. And those places are built, with an underlying assumption that affluent people will always occupy them and that the development pattern will never change and never evolve. And in fact, it can't evolve. And I think, 70, 80 years on, those places will be like you see in Detroit. I mean, there'll be the abandoned houses with the roofs caved in and the trees growing up in them. Anonymous asked, a couple of cities that are politically restricted from geographic expansion, like St. Louis and Baltimore, have had major issues with decline. Yes. At the same time, many cities like Houston that expanded by annexing are doing well. How is this consistent with the maps of tax revenue show? Okay. So let's start with Houston. What is going on in Houston? Houston is the classic development Ponzi scheme. The idea that if you can just create enough growth out on the edge, you can generate enough cash flow to kind of keep everything going. And Houston has done that. Houston has done that quite successfully up to this point in terms of cash flow. When you look at their underlying balance sheet and understand that cities don't track their liabilities this way, so you have to piece a bunch of things together. But I've been to Houston and I've talked to the people doing these things there. And the numbers are just staggering. I mean, the amount of pipe they have to maintain, the amount of roadway they have to maintain, the sheer area they have to provide service to is just astounding. And the kind of cascading costs or the exponentially growing costs that happen the further you go out are just starting to swamp and overwhelm the system. If you look at Houston, the greatest thing that Houston has going for it is that its inner core neighborhoods are fantastic. They are adapting and adaptable, and they have not been burdened with an overly regulatory environment that kind of, from a defensive standpoint, keeps that from happening. If we look at places like St. Louis and Baltimore, it is fascinating because these places have some of the greatest bones that you'll ever see. These neighborhoods are really well constructed and well laid out and well designed, financially very productive, even though they are occupied by, very poor people often, and, neighborhoods that kind of struggle. But what you don't have in Baltimore in particular, and St. Louis to a large degree as well, is this ability to, in a sense, float your core with cash that you gain from the edge. You can't have that developer come in, build that whole new development with pay to put in all the pipes and the roads and everything, roll that cost over into the sale price and the mortgages, and have that free cash flow for 25, 30 years that you can use to go and invest in your core. They basically have this kind of suburban thing happening that they don't, in a sense, financially participate in. They've just had the denuded side. And so I look at Baltimore and particularly St. Louis in this case as almost like a, municipal suicide. Like we did this to ourselves. It wasn't even in exchange for something. It was just, we thought this is what we had to do to become prosperous. All right. There's a series of questions here on maps and mapping and the Taco John's example. What effect do tax breaks for new apartment towers have on Urban 3's map of tax revenue in downtown redevelopment? It's interesting because I don't think, the maps that I showed were not of tax revenue. They were of value. It was value per acre. And so the value is there whether the city is receiving a tax benefit or not. The one I showed of Lafayette, Louisiana was not value. It was actually profit and loss. So it was revenue, but it was also expenses mashed together. So I didn't show any maps of tax revenue. I have seen Urban 3 do these in many places, and depending on the level of intensity, they will go in and subtract out that. But really, what we're trying to show, and what Urban 3 I think is often trying to show with these maps, is not necessarily what things are today, but kind of what a stable long-term development pattern looks like, or what a productive development pattern looks like. So it's a little bit. I mean, that's not what these maps show. Is tax revenue. Patricia, generally, do the current wealth estimates of a central business district include applicable business taxes or just the assessed property taxes on the land and buildings? Let me go through this again and read this. I'm going to emphasize some words. Do the current wealth estimates include business taxes or just assessed property taxes? So wealth versus taxes, two totally different things. And I think this is important because some places use property tax or land tax. Some people use sales tax. Some places have income tax. What we're really looking at here is wealth creation. So let's put it like this. If you have $1 million in a house, or you have $1 million in paintings, or you have $1 million in Beanie Babies or tulips or Bitcoin, I just equated all three of those. Yes, I did. If you have $1 million in that, I don't really care like how that $1 million is taxed. I just think that you have $1 million. And if you have $1 million, you're going to be way better off than if you only have $1,000. And so part of, the idea of building wealth is you're building the capacity within the community of people to contribute to sustaining that community. There's obviously a part of why we do the value per acre analysis, and part of why we look at it in terms of financial productivity is there's a really strong correlation between the wealth that is generated and the cost that the community incurs. The more productive our development pattern, the more return, in a sense, we're getting on our investment. But I would be careful about mixing these terms together, because you just mixed wealth, which is, really very different than tax revenue. The two are not always the same thing. There's places where there are, but they're not always. Joel asks, rundown block versus the new block comparison photos. Does the city prefer the rundown area because it generates more taxes? No, actually, the city preferred the new area, and because it was new. They actually didn't do the math and understand what they had done until it was already over. In fact, when I published it, they were deeply embarrassed and they didn't believe the numbers. They thought it was kind of crazy. And then they went on this, little campaign where they attacked me and said, Chuck is crazy. And then now they kind of get it. And I think are trying to do better. But yeah, in general, the idea was the Taco John's looks like success. The old and blighted block doesn't look like success. And that was as far as the analysis went. And quite frankly, that's as far as the analysis goes in most cities across the US. Very few cities actually sit down and do the math and look at what a productive development pattern is. I think it's important to just note here too, that the analysis of the Taco John's is not, the conclusion is not, okay, go ahead and accept decline. Like run down is great. Like that's what we want. The conclusion that you should take away from the Taco John's is that, wow, if we just gave these places a little bit of love, like if we just leaned into their strengths, look how much money we would have. I mean, look how much wealth we would have in our community. If instead of, having a high-speed highway right out in front of the place, limiting the amount of parking in front, ripping out all the sidewalks to the neighborhood, getting rid of the trees, doing things that basically ignored or were a detriment to the business owners on this block. If instead we said, how do we do things that would actually help this style of business? We would be way more successful. And by the way, wouldn't cost all that much money, wouldn't be spending all that much at all. So to me, that's the real takeaway. What do we do lesson? Brendan asks, Taco John's and Sheets are coming to Columbus. Should we be concerned? And then he says, Realize that some people consider these foods to be delicacies. Well, I consider Taco John's to be a delicacy. Norwegian, Mexican food is a wonderful thing. Should we be worried? I don't think you should be worried about Taco John's or Sheetz. I think you should be worried about a development pattern that costs a lot to provide ongoing service and maintenance to, and doesn't provide nearly enough wealth or longevity to meet that burden. I think you should be concerned about a development pattern that makes your city poorer over time. And I think you should be particularly worried about a development pattern and an approach to building that actually creates this short-term cash incentive for you to take on these long-term liabilities. I think that it is, the wrong approach, and it's one that will ultimately leave you insolvent. All right, there's a couple questions here now on subsidies. Diana asks, doesn't injecting a community with extra stimulus help neighborhoods grow and adapt? How is that considered a patch and not part of a solution? Well, let me look at it this way. Obviously, it depends on the kind of stimulus, but if you have a neighborhood that is struggling and a neighborhood that is insolvent because their development pattern is insolvent, you have houses that have less value and less value potential than they have in costs to provide them service. You've got houses that are spread out 100 feet from each other with all this pipe in the ground and all this road in the ground and sidewalks, and they're not producing enough value. They're not growing enough in value to keep up with even the inflationary costs of maintaining that infrastructure. Is going in and giving that some type of tax subsidy or stimulus in the short term going to help? And I'm like, I don't know. No, really not. Not unless you have a different development pattern, not unless you get at the root of what is causing the insolvency. I think one of the unfortunate things about the way we tend to do economic stimulus today is it really is, a desire to keep the unsustainable going. How do we recover our unsustainability when the economy starts to go bad and is rejecting basically like the way we have done things, saying like, this isn't working. We're not getting good jobs out of this. We're not getting affordable housing out of this. We're not getting the things we need out of this. For some reason, the answer is, well, let's just, put our finger in the dike and hope it holds, as opposed to saying, why is this dike leaking in the first place? Like, why is this happening, and how do we structurally fix that? The stimulus tends to just be, how do we keep this unsustainable, insolvent wreck going? And so I tend to not be a big fan. Could it be done right? Possibly. I think, spending or stimulus or whatever you want to say without reform is really just like continuing to do what got you here, except even more. And I just think that is generally bad policy. Jimmy asks, can TIFs or tax abatement be financially positive in the long run, or is the 15 to 30 year delay on realizing the tax is too much to overcome since cities already struggle to be able to pay for themselves? If the answer is can they, my response would be yes, they can. It is possible to make a tax subsidy investment that would pay off positively for the community. I would say those are unicorns, though. They are never found in nature, right? We tend to not ask a lot of questions when I see cities doing tax increment financing or tax abatement. It generally is a question that starts with a desired outcome. So we desire this business, we desire these jobs, we desire this, investment or whatever it is. And then we use that desire to, in a sense, justify or retroactively support whatever tax subsidy was required to make that happen. When we apply the numbers to these things, they generally, or they don't pencil out. And even the ones that are deemed to be wildly successful are generally wildly successful because we invested $1 million and we got $4 million in tax base. And you're like, wow, that's a 4-to-1. But when you look at the $4 million of tax base and you look at the rate of that wealth creation that is actually then recirculated back to the city, it never gives you $1 million in revenue. You don't actually break even from a money standpoint. So is it possible? Yes. I generally find that tax abatement and tax increment financing is really only something that works or to me should be used in places where you're trying to clean up a mess. We have a mess here. We have a contaminated site. We have, something along those lines. We've got something that never should have been built. And we're going to use tax increment subsidies to get rid of that thing and bring it back to ground zero and then find a partner who can finish that out. All right. Let me take a drink here real quick. Here are 3 questions on zoning and regulation. The first one is from Lucia, another beautiful name. Would you advocate abolishing or adapting zoning laws? Well, if those are my 2 choices, I would pick adapting. I have said a number of times that if you gave me the choice between maintaining what we have for zoning laws or abolishing, I would take abolishing. And so to me, the best outcome is adapt. And I would adapt to something that provided a lot more flexibility, a lot more surety, a lot shorter review processes for things that were the next increment of intensity. That next step should be very, very easy to take. And that would be the best. The second best would be abolishing them all. And then the worst would be keeping the messed up process we have now. Anonymous, not the greatest name, but I'll accept it. Columbus is currently going through a zoning reform process. Traditional media typically frame the conversation as a fight between abolish the single family home types against what some researchers have dubbed neighborhood defenders. Is there any alternate story that you think advocates should advance to avoid this dichotomy? Sure. First of all, abolish a single family home is just a stupid statement. I was going to say is, no offense, but that's just a dumb way to say what it is, because you can always build a single family home. There's nothing in any of these codes that say you're not allowed to build a single family home. What they always say is that you're not required to build only a single family home, which is like a very, very different thing. And I guess I would call any news reporter, to the mat who reported that otherwise. There is no abolishment of the single family home. No one is saying they're illegal. You can't build them. You can go to Manhattan today and buy a lot and build a single family home. I'm pretty sure that would just be really ridiculous because, the investment doesn't make sense. I think it's important, to draw that line. You've got the other side, though, that we're calling neighborhood defenders. And I think, the idea of, neighborhood defenders is again, kind of a misnomer. Cities are human habitat. They're complex ecosystems that they need to evolve and adapt and change. What you have, to me, is you have 2 forces here. One force that is saying, we want our neighborhoods to be able to adapt and change and evolve and grow and respond to new realities. And another group that is saying we want nothing to ever change. And beyond that, we want the rest of the public to, in a sense, ensure that nothing ever changes. We want to use the heavy hand of government, increase taxes, larger amounts of debt, to ensure that my neighborhood never, becomes anything other than what it is today. That is an out of touch, like unrealistic way to live. And so, yeah, I hear you. I hear that, like, that's the way people want to talk about it. For me, I would talk about, why we would use the kind of the heavy hand of government to suppress artificially the evolution and adaptation of a neighborhood. That's the way that I look at it. So another anonymous. We often hear about how the approval process is time consuming and a drain on developer resources, but we also see that most hangups occur with the engineering process. Interesting. How do we, one, change the narrative, and B, put some pressure on engineers to relax some of their standards? Huh. Well, let me take another drink here. When I see the engineering standard thing, it's hard for me not to hear greenfield development. Engineers often get involved are most involved when we're talking about building something new. We're building a new road, we're extending a new pipe, we're putting in a new lift station, we're doing something that is new that requires it to be designed and adapted to existing. Stop building that stuff. I mean, stop building that greenfield stuff. Like, this is not helping you. It's making you poorer. Like, stop doing it. And quite frankly, if that's where the hangup is, like, I don't really care. The engineer should have very little to do with, you taking a single family home in a core neighborhood and adding an accessory apartment or renting out the spare bedroom or converting it into a duplex. That does not really require a lot of engineering and a lot of, technical work to it. And so we should be able to, in a sense, avoid a lot of that just by, dealing with places where we shouldn't have to deal with it. All right. I've got a section here I called Who is Leading? And basically it's like, give us examples from other places. So let's start with Brent. Are there examples of cities that have taken this analysis of what type of development patterns are the most productive and changed their policies in a significant way to encourage more productive development or discourage suburban development? Sure. The one that just came to my mind is Lancaster, California, which is probably not totally fair, but I know that they've been like deep into this for a while and have been doing this. You look around and I get the question all the time, like, where's the strong town? What is the place that has done this the best? And I'm like, it's no place. It doesn't exist. Everybody's working to figure this out in their own local context, making, compromises to try to get closer to a better situation. I've seen a lot of cities that have adapted certain parts of their zoning code. I mean, Minneapolis just adopted last year the Strong Towns, housing approach. They basically said on any lot you can build up to a 3-unit building. This is huge. Cities like Memphis have stopped annexing property and have gone in and made it easier to develop in some neighborhoods. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places, but I think if you're looking for like, a lot of times I get asked this, like, what is the one place that's doing this right that we can go learn from and copy? And I would say there is none. I mean, we all adopted this development pattern post World War II. We all have lived with it. It's a part of like everything that we do within the city and outside the city. In terms of like the finance and insurance and everything else. This is going to take a long time to unwind. And quite frankly, unwinding it is not going to look like a return to the past. It's going to look like an adaptation to something new and different, starting with this denuded, insolvent landscape we have today. I mean, your start conditions are different. And so your end result and your path is going to be different. Joshua asks, what places do you feel are doing better at addressing these issues than others, particularly smaller cities? I think I've got the same answer, right? And I don't really know what you mean by smaller anyway. We're doing a thing called the Strongest Town contest. We do this every year. I think this is our 6th year doing it. We ask people to submit. We ask them a bunch of questions about their place. We ask them to submit to be part of this contest. We pick 16. We put them in a bracket style competition. And then we spend a month looking at these places and trying to learn from them and trying to highlight the things that they're doing really well. So last year it was, oh my gosh, Waterton. I probably screwed that up. I think it was Waterton, South Dakota. But boy, if I screwed that up, I'm going to be embarrassed. The year before it was Pensacola. Yeah, so I would go and check out that and, follow those places and you'll get some good examples of cities doing some really innovative stuff. All right. A couple questions on race. Jan asks, how does racial equity figure into Chuck's approach to making decisions based on productivity of neighborhoods? Um, it's a good question. It's in some ways a tough question. I find that people don't always, respect or appreciate my answer fully. Um, I will say that I did not start down this path focused on racial equity. I'm an engineer and a planner in central Minnesota in a white, almost exclusively white town and an almost exclusively white part of the country. Racial equity was not like a motivating force for me. The thing that I was obsessing about when I started down this path was how do we keep our cities from going broke? Because the projects I'm working on and the things I'm doing don't make any financial sense, and the cities I'm working for are struggling. So how do we do something different? What does that look like? As things started to grow around here, as more people started to read our stuff, as it started to get passed around more, as I started to get invited to go speak places, I found myself talking to audiences that looked a lot like me, middle-aged white men having a conversation about finance of cities. An interesting thing has happened over time. Not only have I just noticed in the crowds and in the conversations and in our general audience and the audience interactions we've had a growing diversity of people, but we have seen this show up in our hiring, in our guest submissions, in lots of different points of contact that we have with people outside of our what now is a 10-person team. I have tried to be as intentional as I can when I do have those interactions, that I stop and pause and try to understand what brought people to the table, what they're looking to get out, what they can offer me, where my blind spots are and misunderstandings are, and what I can learn from this. And while I would say we don't have a racial equity or racial justice lens that we look at this with, we found a lot of overlap with people that do, and a lot of places that we have, seen things the same way. And while we might talk about them a little bit differently, find a lot of ways that we can be allied and work together. Jane asks, how has race affected development of U.S. cities? There are whole books and college courses and everything based on that topic. And yeah, I think there's a kind of endless way to discuss that. Maybe I'll just give two things, and one may get me in a lot of trouble. So I'll put this in two ways. The first one is there's no question that the suburban experiment, the North American development pattern, pioneered during the Great Depression and then implemented across an entire continent all at once after World War II, was an experiment that was led by white people, that was kind of wired to benefit white people and a white experience, and was basically, we can talk about the race dimensions of this, but basically was an affluence growth creation kind of project in response to the Great Depression. And, people didn't really fret all that much about race. Certainly there were some people who did, but as a broad general society, the biggest thing was keeping ourselves out of Great Depression again, alleviating this and moving on to something else. And if we could grow the economy, I think, a lot of people, if we're going to be generous to them, and I think there's reason we should be, felt that, maybe, this is disproportionately benefiting white people today, but we'll get around to everybody. There'll be a rising tide. I think looking back, we recognize that, that didn't happen, and that, the people who did hold that hope or ambition were maybe, blinded by willful neglect or their own, intentions, or didn't ask the hard question. I think there's a lot of ways we can look at this, but certainly practices like redlining, which were, you know, a top-down, overt, kind of centrally planned and organized way to deny capital to certain neighborhoods, really aligned with whether there was, you know, deep racist intentions or not, aligned with some deeply racist outcomes, and, you know, drove disparities that are with us today. So I think that is kind of like the major takeaway, is that when it came to this growth machine we created, we developed mechanisms that poured a lot of capital into the hands of, you know, the quote, the growing middle class, which was white. And at the same time, our policies denied capital, denied those same opportunities to other neighborhoods. I want to add this other parallel observation to this. In doing that, in flooding capital in one area and denying capital in another, we did deep harm to ourselves. If you take race out of it, and stay with me here for a sec, because I feel like this is an important thing. You know, you can't take race out of it, but let's theoretically do this for a minute. If you take race out of it and look at a city where you had, you know, one neighborhood where there will be no capital investment, you know, not only is the private sector not going to have any type of subsidy or incentive, in fact, have lots of regulatory disincentive to not put money there. But another neighborhood is going to get flooded with lots of capital. One neighborhood will have all their mistakes covered up and fixed and corrected and have like this easy glide path to prosperity. And another neighborhood will suffer and will be denied that opportunity. Even if we take race out of this, what we have done as a whole community is made our community poorer, right? We've actually, for no good reason, we have spited ourselves and made our city poorer. Now, overlay race back into this, and you can see that not only was this just destructive to the people even who quote unquote benefited from it, are worse off because of this, but it has created this, you know, deeper, or it's accentuated this deeper underlying tension that you know, stays with us today and kind of confounds us or creates a huge challenge to actually solving some of these systematic and institutional problems. I don't think that would have all gotten me in trouble. Maybe I'll stay away from, I'll in my book, I call race an accelerator of this development pattern. And I think that is very true. A lot of people like to characterize post-World War II development as white flight. And I think there's something like pithy and dismissive about that. And I actually think it doesn't really grasp the full complexity. And because it doesn't grasp the full complexity, I don't think it gets us towards actually dealing with some of the underlying issues that are so wickedly complex. You know, I will note that my hometown experienced the same development pattern as places with a lot of racial diversity. You know, the city of Salt Lake experienced the same development patterns as the city of Atlanta. One is all white people, and one is a pretty healthy mix of you know, people of color and white people. So, you know, if white flight is like the cause of what happened, you know, you have this very strange correlation across the landscape. I think that race is certainly an accelerator in many places. But there was a deeply like nefarious capital thing that went on that, you know, strongly correlates with race in places that have racial disparities. But also, you know, I think in more ways correlates with class and, you know, just a lack of opportunity for some and extra space and opportunity given to others. And again, I'll reiterate, to the detriment of all of us, right? We would all have been better off if these policies had not been segmented the way they were. You know, Black people would be better off, white people would be better off, and all Americans would be better off had we not done something so ridiculous. Zvi, my friend from Montreal, who's checking in on the Ohio State presentation. He says, I guess what really changed in the 20th century was our access to ubiquitous cheap energy. Can we assume that we'll continue to have this access in the future? Recent experience in Texas has demonstrated how fragile our systems are. Thanks, V, my friend. Hang on. I don't know. I think that the easiest answer here is the real one, which is like, I don't know. It's interesting because there are a lot of people who call themselves free market people. And you ask me, are you a free market person or not? I would say, yes, absolutely. I'm a free market person. But I think oftentimes it kind of means different things than what people who strongly identify with free markets would mean. I think a lot of times people who strongly identify with free markets would say things like human beings are innovative, they're creative. When they face a problem, they will adapt, they will figure out new ways to do things. And they posit that as like a optimistic view of our energy predicament. And I will say, I agree with that notion. Human beings will adapt. We will figure things out. We will innovate. One of those, when we talk about innovation, we're generally talking about responses to stresses. Now, there can also be responses to opportunities, and there's certainly people who are working on many clean energy things and things that would create, abundant clean energy and really kind of transform our energy situation. Those people might be successful. If they do, wonderful. So many of the constraints that we have today would be alleviated. That would be a wonderful thing. But I think it's important to understand that from a market standpoint, the most likely thing to drive change and adaptation and new technologies is going to be stress, right? It's going to be rising gas prices, it's going to be rising oil prices, it's going to be scarcity of some of these resources or a lower, energy return on investment for accessing these minerals, more competition for this globally. I don't think we can assume that we'll have access to cheap energy in the future. And in fact, I think that is, clearly one of the embedded assumptions in our development pattern. And I think that is just flat wrong. I remember in the summer of 2008 when gas prices were very, very high here, and you had people doing all kinds of things to avoid that. You had the local school district in a panic because they had built this school out in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden now they got to bus all these kids all over the place, and their budget for busing costs went up by like double. A budget they really had like no control over. Like you pick this location out in the middle of nowhere, you must bus kids. Now here's your costs, like pay the piper. I think that if you were trying to create a development pattern that was resilient to energy shocks and fluctuations, it would look like the traditional development pattern. If you were trying to create a development pattern that would experience the maximum amount of pain and distress based on volatility in the energy markets, it would look a lot like North America. And I have personally, for me, taken kind of some steps to protect myself against this volatility. I live in a neighborhood where I walk to work and I can walk every day, and I really enjoy that. I don't have to get in my car and drive at all. I drive my kids to dance lessons and things like that occasionally, but we could figure that one out. But most Americans are not that way. Most of us are dependent on commutes of some type. And if gas went to 4 gallons or $5 a gallon or $10 a gallon, we would be in a mess. Anonymous is back again. How much of this experimentation is within the authority of city administration versus how much depends on the willingness of banks and traditional sources of capital to take on more risk? What are some of the workarounds to improve access to risk-tolerant capital? That's fascinating. I don't look at this way at all. Let's break this down. How much of this experimentation, so how much of trying new things and investing in new things and deploying money in different ways, whether it's in housing or smaller projects or what have you, how much of that is something that cities can do on their own? All of it. all of it, right? How much are they constrained by banks and sources of capital that would look at this as risky? That's where I want to like dig in a little bit, right? So I think it's important to note that our definition of risk might be a little bit different here. I look at, risk from a financial standpoint, very different than I think what most other people would look at it as. Most people look at risk as, am I doing what everyone else is doing, or am I kind of outside the pack? And I think, in certain situations that is risk, right? There's a saying, you don't have to be able to outrun a grizzly bear. You just have to be able to run faster than the slowest person, right? If you are a bank on Wall Street, you don't have to be without risk. You just have to have less risk than the riskiest bank, because as soon as we start seeing risky banks fall, if you are, in line to be next, if someone falls before you, you will get saved. That's like the nature of our system. So the goal here is to kind of look around and calibrate your risk based on everybody else. And I find that to be like an absurd definition of risk, but that is kind of the way we have evolved to look at this. The reason why we don't have capital for these things is not because there is not a desire for risk. In fact, if you watch any financial news, you will hear people talk about chasing yield. That's a term that you will hear. Chasing yield means looking for higher returning investments. Right now, a 10-year treasury note is paying 1.7%, which people are up in arms because it's gone up a large amount recently because of fears about inflation. But you look at that and like 1.7% is a ridiculously low rate of return. People who are chasing yield will look around and say, what will pay me higher than 1.7%? And what you find is that the only things that will do that are things that are further along on the risk curve. They're things that are innately riskier. And so I don't think our problem is risk. What the problem really is more of a structure of these markets. It's a centralization. There's a truism that it is harder to borrow $100,000 than it is to borrow $100 million. Now, most of us listening to this there's no way we could borrow $100 million, right? It would be impossible for us to borrow $100 million. But for people who have that capacity, large banks, large investors, people with, getting $100 million is like not a big deal. You would be shocked at like the level of disclosure and the, amount of paperwork and the things that go along with getting access to $100 million if you are sitting in that stratosphere and able to make that type of transaction. Like these kind of things happen routinely, regularly. And maybe 100 million is a little high. Maybe 10 million is a better place to put it. But I mean, it's easier in some ways to get $10 million in this current condition. And for things that would be like really risky and really crazy and that you and I might look at and say, well, like this is really dumb. People are throwing money at those things left and right, like all over the place. What they're not throwing money at is the $100,000 project or the $50,000 project or the $10,000 project. And the thing is, that is a market inefficiency. In a theoretical, marketplace, what happens is that when there's a bunch of big free markets, and let me define what I mean by free market, because I kind of said earlier that I'm a free market person, but different than the way a lot of people who identify that way would be. My sense of a free market is Darwin, right? Nature is a free market. It's a market system. That doesn't mean that there aren't players that work together. There's an altruism. There isn't, whatever, but there is a competition in nature for resources. There's a competition for scarcity, and when you look at the way this manifests, what happens is that there winds up to be no real large players, or being a large player is a very difficult thing to sustain over a long period of time. That's because the ability to feed and provide the energy inputs for a large player is really difficult. And the number of small competitors that take advantage of inefficiencies of scale, just, outcompete you. They take over that space. They start to dominate and start to take over. And so it's very difficult to be a large player and sustain as a large player. In nature, there are very few. They tend to be very rare, and they tend to have strategies that are more like a sequoia and less like a fungi, right? Very slow growth over very long periods of time, very stable kind of thing, not very dynamic kind of system. When we look at the marketplace, as in like the economic marketplace, the thing that we would call the free market, what is missing today are those small opportunities, those small players. We have driven them out from a regulatory standpoint. We've made it very difficult for them to employ people, for them to stay, within the marketplace, for them to get started. But most importantly, what we have done through, our monetary policy, through our fiscal policy, through our regulatory policy, is we have created a playing field that creates disproportionate benefits and incentives for large players. We give them strangleholds over the marketplace. We give them access to ridiculous amounts of capital. We have made it very easy for them to quash their competitors and to grow. There's a great book called The Myth of Capitalism. I interviewed Denise Hearn, one of the co-authors of that book, a couple months ago on our podcast. I'd recommend that podcast. I strongly recommend that book. It kind of goes through some of this and lays out, what a marketplace would look like. So I don't think the problem here is risk. I think the problem is localized capital. What we need is more systems of localized capital. We need more systems that, look a lot like the bank in It's a Wonderful Life, where, your savings are in this person's home and their savings are in your car and what have you. We need more of those local capital structures. And, that's only going to come about when we get back to more sane economics. You can't have local capital at 0% interest rates, right? It just doesn't, the incentive to save and to loan is just not there at the local level. So until we get back to something, more approximating normal economics, which, could be in a year, could be in a week, could be in 5 decades. Like, I have no idea. Brian, to many people, infrastructure means fixing congestion and adding lanes. I think the best investment in infrastructure would be updated water and sewer in older areas of all cities. What do you think? Brian, I would recommend going on our site. Just go to Google and type Strong Towns and then type letter to POTUS, P-O-T-U-S, President of the United States. I actually wrote this exact thing to the Trump administration. I was actually invited to give comment on the, one of their infrastructure bill, hypothetical planning. What should we do? And I said this exact thing. I said, if we were going to do anything, it should be maintaining underground infrastructure in traditional neighborhoods. Like, that's the highest returning investment. Especially if we're just throwing stimulus money at the world to try to, make it rain, baby. Anonymous, how does Strong Towns interface with the Main Street approach? That's a good question. I think interface might be the wrong word. The Main Street program and us have a lot of overlap. We're certainly friends. I know those people. Patrice, I think she's the executive director, the CEO of Main Street, did a blurb for my book, and I deeply appreciated that. We're very much friends and aligned. I think, how was I going to say this? I want to say this in a really complimentary way. I think that one of the things that Main Street has done in the last few years is gotten beyond just the idea of their program being a Main Street program, as in 2 blocks of a core downtown. I think they've, and to their credit, many of them have looked at it this way all along. But I think now, as a broad national organization with local state chapters and all this, they've really started to lean into the idea that a successful downtown core, a successful Main Street, actually requires a successful surrounding neighborhood, and the two form an ecosystem that you can't really separate one from the other. I think they've started to recognize that their main enemy is not the mall, and it's not like the highway strip. Their main enemy is just the overall like general deterioration of the neighborhood fabric around them, and that they can get a lot of kind of mileage out of dealing with that issue. Susan, it says Susan with an M. I know sometimes fat fingers, mine will type, M instead of N. So maybe it's Susan. If it's not, Susan. Thank you for the question. Do you favor saving our historic building inventory as a way of building strong towns? In general, yes. I think, overall, the answer to that question is yes. I think we've been vastly too cavalier about tearing down old buildings that have value as opposed to fixing them up and making them work. I do think that there is a line or a threshold, however. I think all neighborhoods need to be able to grow and evolve and change. I think when our goal is to just put, quote unquote, old buildings or historic buildings under glass and prevent them from evolving and changing, that's where I think we do deep disservice to our communities and our places. Historic preservation should be about saving what is there as a method to build off of it, not as a way to kind of, stem decline or destruction. I think when it's the latter, it becomes rather ineffective. But when it's the former, you can start building off of it and complementing it in ways that are really powerful and get you to someplace amazing. Last question then. Wow, we got through a little over an hour. Sarah. Oh, she says, this is a big question. All right. I'm curious of what you view the lasting effects of quarantine on town development. Do you think this pandemic has brought more attention to city centers in a positive light, showing that folks should be more sustaining and protected by disease if they live, interact, work, invest in their city centers? Or do you think the pandemic has brought even more interest in horizontal spread to town outskirts? Curious of your observations. I think this is an open question, and it's interesting because there's a lot of very strong opinions and a lot of debate. I am hyper aware that a lot of times our opinions on these things are, they come about by what psychologists call motivated reasoning, right? We start with a conclusion we want to be true, and then we look for the data and we fill in the gaps to kind of make that true. I was at a meeting this evening. I'm on the parking committee here in my little hometown, and the general consensus from the city planner and other people involved is that now is the time for small towns. And we just have all these people who are going to be moving here now. They hate big cities. They want to leave. They're scary. There's riots. There's, pandemics. Like, just get me to a small town. And there's, the narrative that they're overlaying on this is that, well, we're going to be inundated with growth and development and people wanting to move here. That may be true. I interviewed Richard Florida, the author of Rise of the Creative Class, very influential urbanist. I asked Richard Florida, what do you think the future of New York is? What do you think the future of San Francisco is? And he's like, these places are going to be great. They're going to be fine. Like nothing. I don't even see like hardly a hiccup going on. They've been here for hundreds of years. They're going to be here for hundreds of years. They're going to be great places to be. I talked to friends that live in New York City, and some of them have left, and they've left for all the reasons that you think they might left. They don't feel safe. They are not getting the amenity out of living there. The lockdowns and everything, they can't do the stuff that they like to do. So why live in a cramped place? And they've decamped to the suburbs. I know other people who have wanted to buy in a place like New York, but couldn't because of the housing prices, are now finding ways to get into homes. And, are looking at this as an opportunity to do something that, might only come along once in a generation. And so I think the answer is if we are, honest with ourselves I think we always, believe ourselves to be honest, but if we're truly like rigorous about it and kind of resist our own motivated reasonings, we have to say that like we don't know, right? I look at the general overall economy and I think that it is whacked and insane. I think that, the stock market making new highs every day coming out of a pandemic. I think the idea of having, 0% interest rates across, or near zero across the board, and the massive distorting effect that has that we've kind of talked about already. I think, the idea of sending out thousands of dollars of stimulus checks to people, even people who make, good money and seemingly like don't need it, have never lost their job, have maintained their professional position, have saved in gas money and other things during the pandemic, so have actually had a higher quality of life in a lot of ways. I see all of this as like, kind of wild cards in this system. How long will this go on? Will there be a huge correction to some of these distortions? Will there not be a correction? Will we find a new normal? Is there going to be a new state of being that will dominate for the next century? I don't know. And the reality is like, I don't think anyone knows. And if you hear people saying like, this is what's going to happen, or this is what is, I think you should be very skeptical of them because I don't think they know either. Part of that insight is based off of the work of Nassim Taleb. And I'm going to recommend a couple books here at the end because they've been very influential on me. And I think if you have not read them, they would be very influential on you. There's a guy named Nassim Taleb. He has written a series of books. I started with The Black Swan, but his first book is called Fooled by Randomness. Fooled by Randomness is a great book, and it basically is about that topic. Things happen that are random, and because we believe we're smart, or we have motivated reasoning, or we think we know what's going on, we fill in the blanks and we explain why it's happening. And even worse yet, we make projections about what the future would be, even though what we're looking at is a completely random event with no real, coherent narrative or story that can explain it. This is a common phenomena, and I would strongly recommend Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan. I think the best book of the whole series is one called Anti-Fragile, which is how do we create systems, or how do we have systems that gain from stress? So, your bones gain from having a certain amount of stress every day when you use your body, when you're out walking. If you stay sedentary for a long time, your bones will start to atrophy. They need a certain level of stress. How do we create systems that respond in similar ways? His latest book is Skin in the Game, which talks about, how we create systems where you don't have to have a large regulatory footprint because the internal mechanisms, the skin in the game of the players, kind of regulate the outcome and the mechanisms of how things are done to the benefit of all. So I would recommend picking up anything from Nassim Taleb, digging into it, and trying to ask questions about how we could apply this to our lives and our places. With that, I think my voice is about shot. I thank you all for listening this far. And again, to the people at The Ohio State University, I just want to say thank you for the invitation. For everyone who submitted questions, thanks for taking the time. And again, if I didn't answer your question in the right way, or if I misunderstood, or if you've got another question or a follow-up, go to the Action Lab on Strong Towns at action.strongtowns.org. Look for the answer there, and if you're not finding it, submit it, and we'll do our best to get back to you. Thanks, everybody. Take care and keep doing what you can to build a strong town.